Imagine building a small manufacturing company for 20 years, supplying bolts and brackets to the United States military, only to be told you now owe nearly $600,000 just to keep doing business with your own government. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what tens of thousands of small American defense contractors were staring down this year. A single cybersecurity rule, buried in federal paperwork, threatened to wipe out more small businesses than almost any regulation in modern defense history. And the wildest part is, most Americans have never even heard of it. This is the story of the Pentagon's Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification, known as CMMC, and how it nearly bankrupted the small companies that keep America's military machine running. We're talking about family-owned machine shops, veteran-founded software firms, and third-generation parts suppliers, all suddenly facing a compliance bill bigger than their annual revenue. If you care about small business, national security, or just want to understand how government red tape can crush the little guy, stick around, because this story has more twists than most people realize. Let's start with the basics, because you need to understand what CMMC actually is before you understand why it caused so much panic. The Department of Defense works with hundreds of thousands of companies across the country. These companies build everything from fighter jet parts to software systems to the boots soldiers wear. Many of them handle sensitive government information, things like technical drawings, weapon specifications, and logistics data. The Pentagon calls this information Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI, and Federal Contract Information, or FCI. For years, the government simply trusted contractors to protect this information on their own. Companies would sign a form saying they followed proper cybersecurity practices, and that was basically it. No outside verification, no audits, just an honor system. And if you know anything about cybersecurity, you already know how that story ends. It ended badly. Chinese and Russian hackers spent years quietly breaking into small and mid-sized defense contractors, stealing weapons designs, aircraft blueprints, and sensitive military data. These companies often did not have dedicated IT security teams. They were small businesses focused on manufacturing or engineering, not network defense. A 2022 Pentagon Inspector General review looked at 10 research contractors handling sensitive defense information. Every single one of them was found in violation of basic federal cybersecurity standards. Everyone. So the Pentagon decided the honor system was not working. In 2019, officials introduced the first version of CMMC, of frameworks designed to actually verify that contractors were following proper cybersecurity protocols before they could win defense contracts. Instead of just checking a box, companies would need real assessments, real evidence, and in some cases, real outside auditors coming in to inspect their systems. Sounds reasonable on paper, right? Protect sensitive military data, verify compliance instead of just trusting people, hold contractors accountable. Nobody was arguing against the goal. The problem was always going to be the execution, and that is where things started to unravel. The original 2019 version of CMMC was heavily criticized almost immediately. It was complex, expensive, and confusing, with 5 different tiers of certification that left companies unsure of what they even needed to do. By 2021, the Pentagon went back to the drawing board and released what became known as CMMC 2.0, an attempt to simplify things by cutting the certification tiers down from 5 to 3 and expanding options for companies to self-assess rather than pay for outside audits. That reform process took years. The final rules for CMMC did not officially take effect until November of 2025. Under this rollout, the program was split into phases. Phase 1 began in November 2025 and required companies to complete self-assessments, essentially checking their own homework and submitting the results. That part most companies could handle. It required work, but it was not going to bankrupt anyone outright. Phase 2 was the real gut punch. Scheduled to begin on November 10th, 2026, Phase 2 would have required a huge number of contractors handling sensitive information to get audited by an outside independent assessor called a C3PAO before they could even compete for covered contracts. This was not a self-check anymore. This meant hiring outside firms to comb through your company's policies, interview your employees, test your security systems, and formally certify whether you actually met the government's cybersecurity requirements. And here is where the numbers get genuinely staggering. According to analysis from the Small Business Administration, the total cost of getting through this certification process could reach approximately $593,800 for small firms that needed a full third-party assessment. For companies that qualified for the cheaper self-assessment path, the estimated cost still landed around $388,600. Read those numbers again. Nearly $600,000 just to prove your paperwork was in order, on top of whatever it actually cost to fix the security gaps the audit would uncover. For a massive defense contractor like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, a bill like that is a rounding error. These companies have compliance departments larger than most small businesses' entire workforce. But for a 20-person machine shop in Ohio or a family-run electronics supplier in Texas, that number is not a rounding error. That number is existential. That number can be the difference between staying in business and shutting the doors for good. And it was not just one company facing this. According to Pentagon officials, more than 120,000 small businesses across the defense industrial base were expected to need compliance under the new rules. That is not a typo. Over 120,000 small and medium-sized companies, many of them family-owned, many of them the only qualified supplier of a specific niche part, all suddenly facing six-figure compliance bills within the span of a single year. Now here is where it gets even more absurd. Even if every single one of those companies had the money lying around, which most did, not. There simply were not enough people qualified to do the assessments. At the time the rule was supposed to take effect, there were only around 100 authorized third-party assessors nationwide to handle audits for more than 100,000 companies. Do the math on that for a second. 100 assessors, 100,000 plus businesses, all needing certification within roughly the same tight window before the deadline hit. Pentagon Chief Information Officer Kirsten Davies put it bluntly when she said, "The math simply does not math. You cannot squeeze that many companies through that narrow a pipeline in that short a time frame, not without massive backlogs, outrageous consultant fees driven up by scarcity, and companies losing contracts simply because they could not get an appointment with an assessor in time." Think about what that actually means for a small business owner. You're not just worried about failing an audit. You are worried about not even being able to schedule one before your contract eligibility runs out. Imagine being a profitable, well-run company, fully capable of meeting security standards, and losing government work not because you failed to comply, but because there was no one available to certify that you complied. That is the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that keeps small business owners up at night. Before we go further, if this story is opening your eyes to how government regulation can quietly crush small businesses, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to see this kind of reporting. The financial pressure did not stop at the assessment fee itself. Small contractors faced what analysts described as three separate cost buckets. First, the direct cost of the assessment itself, paying the outside auditors to come in and do their evaluation. Second, the cost of preparing evidence ahead of time, meaning hiring consultants, updating documentation, and getting your systems audit ready before the actual assessment even begins. And third, the cost of actually fixing whatever security weaknesses the process uncovered, which, for many smaller firms running on older infrastructure, could mean a complete overhaul of their IT systems. Stack those three cost categories on top of each other, and you start to understand why business owners were panicking. This was not a one-time fee you could budget for. This was a cascading series of expenses that could balloon well beyond the original estimates, especially for companies that had never invested heavily in cybersecurity infrastructure because, frankly, nobody required them to before. The Small Business Administration's own data projected that future phases of CMMC could end up costing small and mid-sized businesses more than $7 billion annually across the defense industrial base. $7 billion a year flowing out of companies that build the parts, components, and systems that keep America's military supply chain functioning. That is money that could have gone toward hiring workers, expanding facilities, or investing in actual innovation. Instead, under the original timeline, it was set to go toward compliance paperwork and third-party audit fees. And this is where the real fear set in among defense industry insiders. If small businesses cannot afford to compete for defense contracts anymore, who fills that gap? And larger contractors, sure, but larger contractors are not always the most innovative players in the space. A lot of the cutting-edge technology used by the military, from advanced materials to specialized electronics to emerging software capabilities, comes from smaller, nimbler companies, willing to take risks that giant defense conglomerates often will not. If those small innovators get priced out of the system entirely, the entire defense industrial base becomes less competitive, less innovative, and ultimately more expensive for taxpayers in the long run. SBA Administrator Kelly Loeffler did not mince words about the situation, calling the CMMC program an untenable barrier for the small businesses trying to work with the Department of Defense. Meanwhile, Undersecretary of War for Acquisition and Sustainment, Michael Duffy, described the compliance costs as paralyzing, language that is remarkably blunt coming from a senior Pentagon official talking about the Pentagon's own regulatory program. Duffy went even further, saying he had no doubt that CMMC and the incoming Phase 2 requirements specifically had already been keeping companies from competing for defense contracts. In other words, this was not just a future risk. Businesses were already opting out, already deciding it was not worth the fight, already walking away from potential defense contracts because the compliance burden looked too steep to justify the opportunity. There was also a deeper structural issue at play here that goes beyond just dollars and cents. Officials pointed out that the current framework for CMMC had significant overlap with existing regulatory requirements companies already had to follow for handling federal data. So in some cases, businesses were essentially being asked to prove compliance twice through two separate bureaucratic processes for largely the same underlying security obligations. That kind of duplication does not just cost money, it costs time, and time is something small business owners rarely have in abundance. So what actually happened? On July 13th, 2026, the Pentagon made a major announcement. The Department of War, as it is now officially called, announced it was suspending CMMC Phase 2 entirely, immediately, nearly 4 months before the original November 10th deadline. This was not a small tweak or a minor delay. This was a full suspension of the third-party assessment requirements and all associated milestones across current and future defense solicitations and contracts. The announcement came through a memo signed by CIO Kirsten Davies and Acquisition Chief Michael Duffy, and it did not hold back on the criticism. The memo stated plainly that the current version of CMMC imposes significant and often prohibitive burdens, especially on small and non-traditional businesses, and that the program had become, in their words, structurally incompatible with the Pentagon's goals of expanding the defense industrial base. Think about that phrasing for a second. This is not outside critics or small business advocacy groups saying the program is broken. This is the Pentagon's own top acquisition and technology officials, the people responsible for actually running the program, publicly admitting that their own cybersecurity certification framework was actively working against national security goals by driving away the very companies the military needs. As part of the suspension, the department established a new CMMC reform task force, reporting directly to the Pentagon's chief information officer. This task force has 60 days to conduct a full review of the program and deliver recommendations. During that window, the department is also running a public request for information, giving contractors, industry groups, and other stakeholders a chance to formally weigh in on what is working, what is not, and what should change. That comment window closes on August 14th, 2026, giving small businesses a genuine opportunity to shape the next version of this policy before it gets locked back in. Now, before you assume this means small contractors can breathe easy and forget about cybersecurity entirely, that is not the case. The suspension only applies to Phase 2, the third-party assessment piece. Phase 1 requirements, the self-assessment obligations that took effect back in November 2025, remain fully in place. Companies still have to complete those self-assessments. Nothing about that obligation changed. Even more importantly, every single defense contractor and subcontractor handling covered defense information is still contractually bound by an existing regulation called DFARS Clause 2.204-7012. That clause requires companies to safeguard covered defense information regardless of what happens with CMMC. So if you were a defense contractor hoping this suspension meant you could ignore cybersecurity altogether, think again. The underlying legal obligation to protect sensitive government data never went away. What went away, at least temporarily, was the expensive third-party verification process layered on top of that obligation. It is also worth understanding what this suspension legally is and what it is not. According to defense contract attorneys who have analyzed the announcement, this is a policy pause, not a regulatory repeal. The Pentagon suspended implementation through a memo and internal directive, but it did not formally amend the underlying federal regulations that created CMMC in the first place. That distinction matters a lot. A memo reflects the department's current discretion and priorities, but the actual rule sitting in the federal code, specifically in Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations, remains on the books until an official rulemaking process changes it. That means small business owners cannot fully relax and assume this issue is permanently resolved. Legal experts tracking the situation say to watch closely for 3 specific developments over the coming months. First, how the industry responds to that request for information window closing on August 14th, since contractor feedback here could genuinely shape the final policy outcome. Second, whether the Pentagon issues what is called a class deviation or a formal DFARS rule change, or an amendment to the specific regulation governing CMMC, because any of those would represent an actual binding legal change rather than just a temporary pause. And third, how this intersects with a separate, broader rulemaking effort happening across the entire federal government regarding controlled, unclassified information, which got folded into a larger FAR overhaul rulemaking back in June of 2026. If you are a contractor that works with both defense and civilian federal agencies, that broader CUI rule means you may not get much relief at all, even with the CMMC Phase 2 pause in place. If you are finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and subscribe, because we cover stories exactly like this. Big policy decisions that quietly shape entire industries, and you do not want to miss the next one. Let's talk for a moment about what this actually looks like on the ground, because numbers on a page do not always capture the human side of a story like this. Picture a small aerospace parts supplier somewhere in the Midwest, maybe 40 employees, family-owned for 3 generations. This company has spent decades earning trust with the Pentagon, building precision components that show up in aircraft most of us will never see up close. They are not careless about security. They lock their doors, they use passwords, they update their software when they remember to, but they are not running a dedicated cybersecurity operations center either, because until recently, nobody required them to. Now imagine that same company owner opening an email in early 2026, explaining that within the next year, they would need to pay somewhere close to $600,000 to keep doing business with the government they have served for decades. That is not a marketing decision or an expansion plan they can choose to skip. That is a mandatory cost, layered on top of everything else it already takes to run a manufacturing business, from raw materials to payroll to insurance. For a company with steady but modest profit margins, an unexpected 6-figure bill like that does not get absorbed. It gets financed through debt, through layoffs, or through simply walking away from defense contracts altogether. Multiply that single story by well over 120,000 companies, and you start to understand why industry groups were sounding alarms so loudly. This was not a story about a handful of unlucky businesses. This was a systemic shock aimed squarely at the backbone of America's defense supply chain, the thousands of small and mid-sized manufacturers, engineering firms, and technology companies that larger prime contractors rely on to actually build the parts that go into finished weapon systems, vehicles, and aircraft. There's also an important ripple effect worth understanding here, because defense supply chains do not operate in isolation. A single fighter jet or naval vessel might rely on components sourced from hundreds of smaller subcontractors scattered across dozens of states. If even a fraction of those smaller suppliers get squeezed out of the market because they cannot afford compliance costs, larger prime contractors suddenly face their own problem, a shrinking pool of qualified vendors to source parts from. That can mean longer lead times, higher prices passed down the chain, and in some cases, entire production lines getting delayed because a single specialized supplier decided the compliance burden simply was not worth staying in the defense business. This is part of why officials specifically warned that CMMC compliance costs risked delaying the delivery of critical capabilities to actual warfighters. It sounds abstract when you first hear it, but trace the chain of events far enough and it becomes very concrete. Small supplier cannot afford compliance. Small supplier exits, defense work, prime contractor loses a source for a critical part, production timeline slips, and somewhere down the line, a piece of military equipment reaches soldiers later than it should have. All because a paperwork and audit requirement made it financially impossible for a small business to stay in the supply chain. There is also a competitive angle worth understanding, especially when you consider how the United States stacks up against other nations racing to develop next-generation defense technology. Countries like China are pouring enormous resources into expanding their own defense industrial capacity, often without the same layered bureaucratic compliance requirements slowing down their domestic suppliers. If America's approach to cybersecurity regulation ends up shrinking its own pool of defense innovators, even with good intentions behind the policy, that creates a genuine strategic disadvantage in the broader competition for military and technological superiority. Officials at the Pentagon have been increasingly vocal about wanting to speed up innovation and shorten procurement timelines, and a compliance framework that inadvertently drives away the most nimble, creative companies runs directly against that goal. It is also worth pointing out how unusual it is for a federal agency to publicly and directly criticize its own regulatory program in such blunt terms. Government agencies do not typically use words like paralyzing or untenable barrier to describe their own rules. That kind of language usually only shows up when the internal data becomes impossible to ignore, when enough companies are dropping out, enough contracts are going unfilled, and enough political pressure builds from small business advocacy groups and members of Congress representing districts full of small manufacturers. The fact that both the Small Business Administration and top Pentagon acquisition officials use such direct language tells you just how severe the internal warning signs had become before this suspension was announced. There is a bit of historical irony worth noting as well. CMMC exists specifically because the honor system approach to cybersecurity compliance was clearly failing, with Inspector General Audits finding widespread violations among contractors who had simply self-certified their own compliance without any outside verification. Yet the proposed solution, rigorous third-party verification, ended up creating a different kind of failure, one where the verification system itself became so expensive and so bottlenecked by assessor shortages that it threatened to collapse under its own weight before it even fully launched. Neither extreme, pure self-attestation nor an overly rigid third-party audit requirement seems to have actually solved the underlying problem cleanly, which is exactly why this next round of reform, guided by the upcoming task force review, carries so much weight for the future of the entire defense industrial base. Let's zoom out for a second and think about the bigger picture here, because this story is not really just about paperwork and audit fees. It is about a much larger tension that exists at the heart of national security policy. On one hand, the Pentagon absolutely needs strong cybersecurity across its entire supply chain. We are talking about sensitive military technology, weapons designs, and logistics, data that foreign adversaries would love to get their hands on. A single vulnerable contractor, even a tiny one making a seemingly minor component, can become the weak link that lets hackers infiltrate a much larger network of sensitive information. This is not a hypothetical risk. It has happened before, repeatedly, which is exactly why CMMC was created in the first place. On the other hand, if the compliance burden required to prove that security becomes so expensive and so complicated that it drives small businesses out of the defense industry entirely, you end up creating a different kind of national security risk. A shrinking, less competitive industrial base. Fewer companies willing to bid on defense contracts means less innovation, less competition on pricing, and greater reliance on a small handful of giant contractors who may not move as quickly or think as creatively as smaller, more specialized firms. Officials have explicitly warned that CMMC compliance costs were forcing innovative companies out of the defense industrial base, and that this would ultimately delay the delivery of critical capabilities to actual warfighters in the field. So really, this whole saga boils down to finding a balance between two legitimate but competing priorities: real cybersecurity protection for sensitive military information, and a defense industrial base that remains open, competitive, and accessible to the small businesses that have historically driven so much of America's technological edge. Getting that balance wrong in either direction carries serious consequences. Too lax, and you leave the door open for foreign adversaries to steal sensitive defense technology. Too strict, and you accidentally hand the entire defense supply chain over to a small number of massive corporations while pushing out the scrappy innovators who often come up with the best ideas. It is also worth remembering that this is not actually the first time this exact cycle has played out. Back in 2021, during an earlier version of the same debate, the Pentagon paused CMMC implementation to conduct another sweeping review, specifically because of concerns about compliance costs and burdens on small businesses. That review led to the creation of CMMC 2.0, the simplified three-tier version that eventually rolled out in phases starting in late 2025. In other words, we have now seen this exact pattern repeat itself. Ambitious cybersecurity rule gets announced. Small businesses raise alarms about crushing compliance costs. Pentagon pauses the program, conducts a review, and eventually rolls out a revised version. Whether this current pause leads to another meaningful simplification, or whether Phase 2 eventually comes back largely unchanged after the 60-day review, remains to be seen. For small business owners currently working in or hoping to enter the defense industry, the practical advice from experts tracking the situation is fairly consistent. Do not throw away any documentation or gap assessment work you have already done to prepare for CMMC compliance. That work did not become worthless just because Phase 2 got paused. Phase 1 self-assessment obligations remain active. Your existing DFARS cybersecurity obligations remain active, and whatever the eventual outcome of this review turns out to be, having your documentation and security posture already in reasonably good shape will only help you, not hurt you. It is also worth small businesses actually participating in that request for information process before the August 14th deadline. This is a genuinely rare moment in federal policymaking where officials are actively asking for real cost data and real feedback from the companies most affected by the rule. And industry insiders have specifically pointed out that small and mid-sized business voices risk being underrepresented in that process unless owners actually take the time to submit their input. If you run a small defense contracting business and you have been quietly frustrated by these compliance costs for years, this is your chance to actually have your concerns heard by the people writing the next version of the rule. There's also a broader lesson buried in this story that applies well beyond the defense industry specifically. Anytime a government agency creates a new compliance framework, whether it is cybersecurity, environmental regulation, financial reporting, or anything else, there's always a risk that the framework ends up disproportionately burdening smaller players, while larger competitors simply absorb the cost as a normal part of doing business. Big companies have compliance departments, legal teams, and enough revenue to treat six-figure certification costs as a manageable line item. Small companies often do not have any of that cushion. A rule that looks reasonable and necessary on paper can end up functioning, in practice, as a quiet mechanism for consolidating an entire industry into fewer, larger hands. That does not mean cybersecurity regulation itself is a bad idea. The underlying problem CMMC was designed to fix was real. Contractors really were failing basic security standards. Foreign adversaries really were targeting the defense supply chain. The goal of verifying, rather than just trusting, that companies protect sensitive information is a legitimate and important one. But the execution matters just as much as the intention. A well-designed policy needs to account for the fact that a 20-person machine shop and a 50,000-person defense conglomerate operate under completely different financial realities, and treating them identically under the same compliance framework can produce wildly unequal outcomes. Going forward, keep an eye on a few specific dates and developments if you want to follow how this story ends. The request for information window closes August 14th, 2026, and whatever feedback comes out of that process will likely shape the recommendations from the CMMC Reform Task Force. That task force is expected to deliver its findings roughly 60 days after the July suspension announcement, which puts their report landing sometime around mid-September of 2026. Watch specifically for whether the Pentagon issues a formal DFARS, rule change, or class deviation afterward, because that would represent the actual binding legal outcome of this whole review process, rather than just another temporary policy pause. Also worth watching is how this interacts with that broader federal rulemaking on controlled unclassified information that got folded into the FOIR overhaul process back in June 2026. Contractors who work across both defense and civilian federal agencies need to pay close attention here, because a pause specifically on CMMC Phase 2 does not necessarily protect them from new CUI handling requirements coming through that separate, broader rulemaking track. At the end of the day, this story is a pretty striking example of how a well-intentioned cybersecurity policy can spiral into a genuine existential threat for the small businesses it never intended to destroy. More than 120,000 small companies were staring down compliance bills approaching $600,000 with barely 100 qualified assessors, available nationwide to actually process them all. The Pentagon's own top officials openly admitted the program had become, in their words, structurally incompatible with keeping the defense industrial base healthy and competitive. And for now, at least, small contractors have gotten a reprieve, buying time while officials figure out a version of cybersecurity compliance that protects sensitive military information without accidentally bankrupting the small businesses that build so much of what the military actually depends on. Whether the eventual solution gets it right this time is still an open question. And honestly, given how many times this exact cycle has repeated itself since 2019, a healthy amount of skepticism seems reasonable. But for the small business owners who were staring down a six-figure compliance bill just weeks before it was supposed to take effect, this pause represents genuine, tangible relief, even if it is only temporary. One more thing worth sitting with before we wrap up. Stories like this rarely get much mainstream attention because, on the surface, they sound like dry regulatory news, the kind of headline most people scroll right past. But underneath that dry headline sits a real, tangible threat to real people's livelihoods, real companies that took decades to build, and a real question about whether America's defense industry stays open and competitive or slowly consolidates into the hands of a shrinking number of massive corporations. These are the kinds of decisions that quietly reshape entire industries, long before most people notice anything has changed. And once an industry consolidates around a handful of giant players, it rarely reverses course easily, because small businesses that get pushed out during moments like this often do not come back once the pressure eases. That is exactly why paying attention to stories like this matters, even if cybersecurity compliance rules sound painfully technical at first glance. Behind every regulatory acronym and every phased rollout deadline sits an actual decision about who gets to participate in building America's national security infrastructure, and who gets priced out entirely. For now, the 60-day review, the upcoming task force recommendations, and the request for information window closing in mid-August all represent a genuine opportunity to get this balance right, protecting sensitive military information without accidentally dismantling the small business ecosystem the Pentagon depends on for innovation and competitive pricing. Whether officials actually seize that opportunity or whether this turns into just another temporary pause before Phase 2 eventually returns. Largely unchanged, is a story still very much being written in real time. If you want to understand more stories like this, where government policy quietly reshapes entire industries behind the scenes, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, and drop a like if you made it this far, because it genuinely helps more people discover this kind of reporting. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.